Today I'll walk you through the process that I went through when painting this Bay-breasted Warbler in its non-breeding plumage. This is a small 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor done on a block of Kilimanjaro 140-pound cold pressed paper. Actually, this was my very last sheet of this surface. I find it to be a great cold pressed paper that takes a wash beautifully, but isn't terribly rough, so it's still good for detail work. Before recording, I started the painting by transferring the main lines from my sketchbook to my block of paper and masking off the foreground with liquid Frisket. I wanted a blurry background of sky and foliage so the bird had a good sense of environment. Blurry or soft backgrounds are best done with wet-on-wet washes, so I started saturating my paper with clean water. That would help the paint mix smoothly on the page. After pre-mixing my background colors, I checked to ensure that the page was evenly saturated before bringing in my paints. After tilting the page, I used a number 6 round brush to add a mix of cerulean and ultramarine blue, more or less from the top of the page down, and then began introducing some of my pre-mixed greens and oranges. Before finishing up with the greens, I streaked in some background branches using a grayish color made of Indian red, ultramarine blue, and dioxazine purple, and then went back to dropping in my blurry foliage. I washed in some extra pigment here and there so it would add to the variety of colors and saturation, and then brought in some really dark greens to the outer edges to boost the contrast. Things were starting to set up on the page, so I hit everything with the hairdryer to lock the colors in. My next pass was to add some sharp edges and middle ground leaves, as well as to bring in a little more color saturation and depth to some of the orangey blurry regions. Some of these oranges look intense here, but once I add the yellow orange of the foreground leaves, they should really work well. At least that was the plan. Again, I used the hairdryer to lock that all onto the page. I added in more sharp edges as suggestions of leaves in order to imply a middle ground layer of foliage. I did this by selectively darkening areas to make them recede. I wasn't going for a lot of detail, just a suggestion of some hard edges here and there and a bit of contrast to add definition. Later in the painting I can add more details if needed, and it all sort of reads as a jumble of leaves. I thought the background was pretty good at this stage, so I hit it again with the hairdryer and then removed the Frisket. Afterwards, I went about transferring the foreground portions of my sketch using a tracing paper transfer. I'll put a link in the video description to a post explaining that technique. With the white of the paper showing, I started doing a quick wash of shadow color over all the foreground elements. I did this with the number 2 round brush using ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple, which is a variation of my sky color. This will establish my overall lighting and help the colors harmonize as the rest of the paint hits the paper. Once those were in, I started putting in the lightest local colors, starting with the largest amount of surface area. In this case, it was the green of the leaves. I used all sorts of greens on this project. My base colors were phthalo and sap greens with various warm colors. I used cadmium red for the darkest saturated tones, chrome orange for the warmer olive sort of colors, and lemon yellow for the most intense bright greens. Next, I blocked in the darks of the wings and tail using a mix of Indian red and dioxazine purple. I used some of that same color to put in the main colors on the branches. With those base colors in, I glazed in a second pass of colors to the branches to get the initial shading rendered. I also used some permanent alizarin crimson to put in some buds before adding a third layer of glazing to the branches. Using some of my same permanent alizarin crimson, I added some red spotting to my leaves. In my photo reference, the spotting was only on a few leaves, but it looked cool, so I put it on most of them. For some reason, I find the ratty, decaying leaves much more interesting than the perfectly clean, healthy leaves. They certainly say fall more than just showing a slight yellow or orange shift in color. Next, I started glazing in more color to the leaves. In many cases, that meant adding lemon yellow and bright greens as a transition from the spots and veins on the leaves. It'll take many passes of color to build the saturation, depth, and textures of the final leaves. On this painting, I was following my basic lighting from my reference photos, but was changing up the colors on the leaves a lot, pushing them more yellow and adding more orange-brown and dark red spotting. Those colors should better match with the background that I've already painted. as well as the olive colors that will eventually go on the bird's head. The red spotting and small buds will also help pull in the subtle warm bay colors on the bird's sides that will come in later. With more work done on the leaves, I took a little break and put in another pass of color on the branches before diving right back into the leaves, where I added a lot of detail to the spotting with saturated reds. The leaves probably accounted for the largest amount of time since they took up so much surface area. As I glazed in detail, I got progressively darker and more opaque with my layers. If you go dark too early, the paint has a tendency to lift and smudge and your colors get muddy. Glazing isn't the fastest process, but it does allow you to build great color depth and texture. After adding a little more detail to the branches, I worked a bit on the background foliage, adding some more edges and definition using darks. This should help make some of that background wash look like leafy shapes without providing a ton of information. Following that, I added a bit more glazing to the branches, eventually adding some pinkish layers to warm them up a bit. Now back to the leaves. I change what I'm working on now and again for two reasons. First, it keeps things from getting boring, and second, by taking a break, when I come back to an area, I look at it with fresh eyes and notice things that need adjustment. It's a continual process of refinement rather than just working on something until that one particular section's finished. That process of working the painting as a whole was driven into me in art school and is one of the most valuable processes that I learned there. For some reason, I kept neglecting the leaves in the top middle part of the painting. There were so many to paint, but those were sitting isolated from the rest of the leaves and frequently got ignored as I worked around. At this point, my bird was starting to need some serious attention. I started with a light wash of desaturated red on the sides. For the legs, I put in a quick pass of cadmium red and a touch of dioxazine purple. Then I started putting in some light greens on the head and face using sap green and a little chrome orange. I followed that up by intensifying my shadows on the bird's belly and under the wing's edge with some gray purples. I used some of those same colors from the gray on the back and beak, and then glazed in another layer to the shadows in the feet. I broke out the 10-aught brush to put in the detail around the eye, beak, and feet. I tend to only use those tiny brushes when I have to because they hold so little pigment. I switched back to my sharp number 2 round to add some dark details to the tail and wings before adding another layer of olive colors to the head. I brought in a light yellow glaze to the face and the neck as it moved back to the sides. Like the leaves, I jumped around a lot on the bird, slowly adding glazes of darker colors. My first passes were bigger areas, and as I progressed, I started getting more opaque and streaking in some small details of feathers. It's definitely a gradual process, but it does end up developing pretty convincing textures. I'm not really interested in being photorealistic. I want it to look like a painting, but I also like having a lot of accuracy in its textures. I switched back to the 10-aught brush for more tiny details. A couple of passes of precise brush work really adds a lot of pop to the painting. Birds like this fall bay-breasted warbler are pretty cryptically colored. This helps them hide from predators in their environment, but it doesn't always make for a great painting. I'll often try to manipulate the setting in order to show off the bird a bit, while still displaying its kind of camouflage look. In this case, I chose to put in a break in the foliage behind the bird with some sky coloration, and this allowed the bird to pop out from the background a bit and to frame it up nicely, but we still see that the bird's colors blend in well with its habitat. While the actual sketching and painting are great fun, I always get a lot of enjoyment out of figuring out how to frame up the bird and change up the branches and backgrounds to make the final work more interesting. I'll often mock things up on the computer and do color tests before investigating the time in the final painting. With oils and acrylics, it's easy to rework and repaint things if you change your mind or mess something up. With transparent watercolor, you kind of just have one shot at it. If something goes wrong, you really can't cover it up. Instead, you just start over. Because of this, I tend to spend a lot more time trying to solve design and color problems in sketchbooks or on the computer before starting on the paper. Warblers are one of my favorite birds to paint. I've done bay-breasted warblers a few times before, but only in their spring plumage. Many warblers have incredibly drab plumage in the fall, and this can cause a lot of confusion with identifications. In central Michigan, two species that can be particularly hard to tell apart are the bay-breasted warbler and the black-poll warbler. They look nothing alike in the spring, but in the fall, well, that's a completely different story. Fall bay-breasted warblers have less streakings, sometimes retaining a bit of light bay coloration on their sides, and they lack the yellow feet of black-poll warblers. Otherwise, they look a lot alike. In the field, I can't always tell them apart, especially at a distance or against a white sky, and I just call them bay-poll warblers. Many birders don't spend a lot of time birding in the fall because the IDs can be so difficult. I learned a ton by visiting Michigan State University's banding station, where the staff would generously show you birds in hand and describe the best ways of telling confusing fall warblers apart. One of the reasons I really love fall birding is that the sheer number of birds in the fall is dramatically increased compared to the spring, with a large number of young birds, plus they've had no casualties from migration to and from their overwintering sites, and that means that there are way more birds to be seen in the fall. Plus, it's kind of fun to learn and test new ID skills. It can seem like you're getting to see a whole new bird in some cases. From here out, the bulk of the work was done, and it was really a question of going through the entire painting, cleaning up all sorts of small details that needed to be fixed, and sharpening up a ton of edges so everything looked really finished. A good example of this sort of cleanup are the thin petioles on the leaves. Sometimes the frisket isn't as clean in those areas, so I'll have to carefully refine the edges so they look nice and sharp. Small details like that can add a lot of interest, but if they have ratty and incomplete edges, well, that may attract the wrong sort of attention. I clean them up so I can show them off. I'll often wear a magnifying visor for these tiny details, and you probably can see that pop into the frame now and again. A lot of the later efforts are to find a good balance in detail. I think it can be nice to let some areas be a little less refined while others are highly polished up. It took me a while to figure out where to hide my signature on this one. After that, I picked away at a few more details before deciding that the painting was finished. In the end, I was really happy with this fall bay-breasted warbler. I've not seen many paintings of fall warblers sporting the non-breeding plumage, but it was great fun to paint. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to watch this painting take shape. I hope you get a chance to paint soon.